was so short.
So true.
He said it. I'm just pointing it out.
I appreciated it for other reasons.
Oh, yeah, well, I'm glad somebody's heard the content. But interestingly enough, Davin handed out these sheets for me a little earlier than I had anticipated, which means you had an opportunity already to read them, study them, and of course know the sermon. So I don't actually feel a need to give one today, since you've already read it. But if I were to ask you the question, where do you think, have any of you had a chance to read it since? No. So, it's very interesting. When I was in college, I was always insulted by the professor who would assign a reading, and then he would go through the reading. Right? Like as if you couldn't understand the reading yourself, he had to then get it back, like spit it back to you again. So I was always insulted by it. So I appreciate the fact that you haven't read the text yet, because now I can teach it to you without insulting you. Did anybody follow any of that?
Yes.
No.
Very sensitive.
I'm a very sensitive person. Okay? All right, so here's the text. There are 3 texts, and I'm going to tell you what they say, and then I'm going to tell you what I think the point is. All right? That's basically what a sermon is. All right? It's a text. I explain the text, and then I tell you what it really means. Okay? Which means I really want to read something else into the text. Right, so there are 3 basic texts here on the page. One is the initial statement, but you shall appoint the Levites over the tabernacle of the testimony. They shall carry the tabernacle and all its furnishings, and they shall minister to it, and they shall encamp around the tabernacle. That is, the job of the Levite was to minister in the tabernacle, which eventually would become the temple. The tabernacle is the portable version of what would become the temple in Jerusalem. And they built this during the book of Leviticus. And now in the book of Bamidbar, we're assigning tasks. Now, originally, Rashi, you can see the next statement on the page. Rashi, it says, "For all the firstborn are mine, but I have taken the Levites instead of the firstborn." So you may recognize this very famous ritual, and that is what we refer to as Pidyon Haben, redemption of the firstborn. So Rashi, you can see his comment is not actually on the verse that I was selected. You see, it's chapter 1, verse 50, and Rashi's comment's actually on verse 15 of chapter 3. So you can see it's actually not in the same verse. But he's explaining how we got from firstborn serving in the tabernacle to the Levites in their stead. So you know what happens. The Avudraham says it beautifully in his commentary on Pidyon Haben. He says, the Avudraham says, that the father of the firstborn male is supposed to say to the Kohen, "Here is this money. I prefer my son over all the money in the world." It's a beautiful statement. It's something that parents should be saying to their children all the time. But in this case, the Avudraham says it's said for the firstborn. Now, what's really interesting, right, is we see an evolution of practice. The evolution is very simple. Originally, the thought was every family would be invested in the work of the temple, the tabernacle initially, right? And they would do that by giving their firstborn son over in service to the tabernacle. And this way, every family would be invested. I'm so excited I have to lower my voice 1 second. That's what happens. If you haven't noticed that in the last 10 years, when I get really excited, my voice gets to be a screech point where you can't listen anymore. So I see the pain on your face, so I'm going to lower my voice. So every family would give over their firstborn to serve in the tabernacle. And then people started saying, really? We need him at home, right? Let's just hire someone to do it, right? Right? That's what we Jews do, right? We don't make dinner. We make reservations, right? It's the same thing, and that is this idea that we'll just contribute money to the tabernacle, and you'll hire a group of people who will do this service. And that's where Rashi says, you can see, Al Yad HaBchorot Zakiti Vahem, V'Halevim Shelo Avdu Al Yedei Zeh Nivcharu Tachtehem. That the firstborn are taken, or the Levites are taken instead of the firstborn. So what we have done is we've outsourced the work of the tabernacle. And then the Sforno says something really, really beautiful. He says they're responsible then for the holiness of the tabernacle. They were to be encamped immediately adjacent to the sacred domain of the tabernacle. That is, the Levim became wholly adjacent. Okay? And that becomes a beautiful model, right? And that is that we have these firstborns who are supposed to serve in the temple. Instead, each family outsources it to the Levim, and the Levim are then charged to care for the holiness of the temple. Okay? And to me, that's both beautiful and incredibly sad at the same time. So here is where I tell you a story. This week, we hosted, our congregation hosted, you don't know this because you weren't invited. We hosted a clergy roundtable here in the library, in which I had the opportunity to sit with many of the clergy from the river towns to what has become a theology roundtable, in which we bring texts, we study them together, and we decide how they apply to us in our own ministries. It was an extremely powerful luncheon because the conversation quickly after the theological issues were dealt with moved to our own personal circumstances in which, as Harold Bloom put it, we begin to feel as religious exemplars. A religious exemplar, according to Harold Bloom, is somebody who behaves for the community on behalf of the community. Now, in the Christian faith, that's much more so than it is in the Jewish faith, right? You need a priest, a reverend, a pastor, a minister in order to go through various cycles in the Christian tradition, right? So for the giving of the Eucharist, right, you need a clergy person. Not anybody can just get up there. And that follows a model that is actually born of Jesus, who says it's only through Jesus that you can get to God. The Jewish people completely reject that model. The Jewish people say we're a religion of the masses. When Ezra and Nehemiah start reading the law publicly, they've taken the book away from the Levites and the priests and said it's not Torat Kohanim, it's Torat Yisrael. It's not the book for the Kohanim, their handbook for how they ought to minister in the tabernacle. It's really supposed to be read by everybody. And that's why they instituted the public reading of the scroll, the Torah, on Mondays, Thursdays, and on Shabbat. Because we're a religion of the masses in which everybody has access. You know you don't need a rabbi to officiate at a wedding. Anybody can do it. You know you don't need a rabbi to officiate at a funeral or administer last rites. You don't need a rabbi to conduct a bris. In fact, most rabbis don't do brises. We stand there and we name the child afterwards, but we don't really have a task because we're a religion of the masses. What's really, really interesting is our religion is trying to recapture that initial stage in which every family is supposed to be invested in the holiness of the tabernacle on their own and not by proxy. So look at this last statement by Jonathan Sacks, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, one of the great, great minds. He was the chief rabbi of England. And he says the following in a wonderful, wonderful book. The service of God is not a private affair. It's a responsibility carried on behalf of others. That is to say, he's trying to reconcile the fact that everybody was supposed to be initially invested and that we have given it over to the Levites. It's now time to reclaim it ourselves and to invest yourself. You know, they used to say about cantors that they weren't ordained, they were invested. I don't know if you remember that term. But recently we have changed it to ordained, right? I'm a rabbi, I'm an ordained rabbi. Ordination has a very different connotation than investiture. Ordination seems to come from the sense that God ordained it. Investiture is something in which you make a personal investment. Cantor's Assembly has decided they're no longer going to be invested. they're going to be ordained. That doesn't mean they're not invested. It just means they're additionally ordained, right? I think that's really the message that I'm trying to bring this morning, and that is we each need to take responsibility for our own holiness. We need to take responsibility individually for our own religious and spiritual lives. That we can't give it over to somebody else. Expect that the rabbi is going to behave a certain way on behalf of us, because as you know, I don't. But the point is a very simple one, and that is we need to reclaim our own spirituality, our own religious life, our own ordained sense of who we are supposed to be. Shabbat Shalom. It was a little long, I know, Jeff, but it was not bad. The timing was good. Okay, good. Page 108.